He stood there, his arms crossed over his chest, and his eyes narrowed, and said the words that would echo in my head for years. "You'll never be enough." It wasn't a shout or a scream, it was something worse. His voice was calm, almost bored, like he was stating a fact he thought everyone in the world already knew. In that moment, something inside me cracked. I felt like the ground shifted under my feet, like everything I'd ever believed about myself was suddenly in question. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. All I could do was stare at him, my mind racing and my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to argue, to fight back, to prove him wrong, right there on the spot. But no words came out. They stuck in my throat thick and heavy, and all I could do was stand there in silence. He didn't seem to care. He just watched me with that same flat expression, like he was waiting for me to realize he was right. And then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there in the middle of the room, feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. For a long time after he left, I just stood there. The world around me kept moving, people walking past, conversations buzzing in the distance. But it all felt like it was happening in another universe. My world had narrowed down to those 5 words, and the echo of them in my head. "You'll never be enough." I went home that night and lay awake in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling while those words repeated in my mind. I thought about every time I'd tried and failed, every moment I'd doubted myself, every time I'd wondered if maybe I really wasn't enough. It was like his words had given a voice to every fear I'd ever had. The next morning, I woke up with that same tightness in my chest, like there was a weight pressing down on me that I couldn't shake. I went through the motions of my day, getting dressed, going to work, talking to people, but it all felt hollow, like I was just going through the steps of someone else's life. And the worst part was, I started to wonder if he was right. Maybe I really wasn't enough. Maybe I'd been fooling myself all this time, thinking I could be more than I was. The doubt was like a poison in my veins, and no matter how hard I tried to push it away, it kept coming back. But even in the middle of all that doubt, there was a part of me that refused to give in. A small, stubborn spark that whispered, "No, you're not done yet." I didn't know how to listen to that voice at first. It felt easier to believe him, to let his words define me, and stop trying. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't let the last word about who I was belong to someone who'd never really seen me in the first place. So I started small. I wrote down everything he'd ever said to me, every insult, every cutting remark, every time he'd tried to make me feel like I wasn't enough. I wrote them down in a notebook and read them out loud to myself, not because I wanted to hold on to them, but because I wanted to take their power away. Some nights I'd sit at my desk with that notebook open in front of me and read those words again and again until they didn't hurt as much. Until I could see them for what they were, his fears, not mine. His need to keep me small so he wouldn't have to feel small himself. It wasn't easy. There were nights when I'd close that notebook and still feel like those words were etched into my bones. Nights when I'd lie awake and wonder if I was just pretending, if I was really as empty and inadequate as he'd said. But I kept going. I kept working, kept trying, even when it felt like I was moving through molasses. I took on projects that scared me, said yes to opportunities, even when I was sure I'd fail. I started to see that every step forward was a kind of quiet rebellion against his voice. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. It felt too raw, too personal. This wasn't about proving anything to the world. It was about proving something to myself, about taking back the pieces of me that I'd let him steal. I worked late into the night, long after the rest of the world had gone to sleep. I'd sit in the dim light of my desk lamp, the only sound the quiet hum of the city outside, and I'd push myself to keep going. To keep building something real, even if no one else could see it yet. And slowly, I started to feel stronger. The words he'd said didn't sting the same way they used to. They were still there like a scar I'd carry with me forever, but they weren't the whole story anymore. One night, as I was finishing up a project that had seemed impossible, just a few weeks before, I caught my reflection in the dark window. For the first time in a long time, I didn't see someone who wasn't enough. I saw someone who was still fighting, someone who hadn't given up. I knew I wasn't done, There were still so many things I wanted to do, so many ways I wanted to grow. But I also knew that I didn't need his permission to keep going. I didn't need anyone's permission but my own. And maybe that was what being enough really meant. Not being perfect, not meeting anyone else's expectations, but refusing to stop. Refusing to let someone else's voice be louder than your own. As I turned off the light and crawled into bed that night, I felt that same spark in my chest, the one that had kept me going when everything else felt like it was falling apart. I held on to it like a promise, because I knew that no matter what he'd said, no matter how many times I stumbled, I wasn't done yet. I was just getting started. Question at the end. Have you ever had someone's words haunt you, threatening to define you forever? I have. But I'm done letting anyone else write my story. The morning after I decided to start fighting back, the world didn't look any different. The sun rose, the traffic roared by outside my window, and I went about my routine like nothing had changed. But inside, everything felt different. There was a small crack in the darkness, a glimmer of something that looked like hope, even if it was fragile and flickering. I clung to that feeling even as the days stretched out in front of me like an endless road. Because the truth was, there were still a lot of moments when his voice was louder than mine. Moments when I'd be halfway through a project full of energy and determination, and then I'd hear his words in the back of my mind. You'll never be enough. And just like that, my hands would freeze on the keyboard, my breath would catch in my throat, and I'd feel the doubt creep in. Some days it felt like I was fighting a battle I couldn't win. Like every time I started to believe in myself, his voice was there to pull me back under. It was a constant war between the part of me that wanted to prove him wrong and the part of me that was so tired of trying. I started spending more time alone, not because I didn't want to be around people, but because I couldn't stand the idea of anyone seeing how raw and shaky I felt inside. My friends would text me, asking me to come out to grab a drink or see a movie. I'd always find a reason to say no. I told them I was busy, that I had too much work, that I needed to focus. And maybe that was true. But more than that, I was afraid that if I let my guard down, if I let them see how vulnerable I was, they'd start to believe his words too. So I isolated myself. I poured everything I had into my work, trying to drown out the voice in my head, with long hours and late nights. I told myself that if I just kept moving, if I just kept working, I'd outrun the doubt. But it didn't work that way. The doubt was always there, waiting in the quiet moments, when the world slowed down, and I had to face myself. At night, I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with everything I wasn't. I'd think about all the times I'd failed, all the times I'd fallen short of what I wanted to be. I'd remember the way he'd looked at me when he said those words like, I was something small and broken, something that could never measure up. And I'd wonder if maybe he was right. Some nights, I'd get up and pace the apartment, my thoughts churning like a storm I couldn't outrun. I'd stand in front of the mirror and stare at my reflection, trying to find the person I wanted to be in the tired eyes staring back at me. But all I saw was someone who was still trying to convince himself he was worth the fight. But even on the darkest nights, there was a part of me that refused to give up. It was stubborn, that part, like a weed growing up through concrete. No matter how many times I doubted myself, it kept whispering, keep going, you're not done yet. So I did. I kept going. I kept working even when it felt like I was just going in circles. I read books about people who'd failed 1,000 times before they finally succeeded. I watched videos of people talking about how they'd clawed their way out of the darkness. I soaked up every story of resilience I could find, hoping that some of it would rub off on me. And slowly, something started to shift. It wasn't some magical transformation. I didn't wake up one morning suddenly fearless and whole. But there were small changes, little victories that reminded me I was moving forward, even if it didn't always feel like it. I landed a small job that I'd thought was out of my reach. I finished a project that had scared me so much I almost didn't start. Each time I felt a little stronger, a little more sure of myself. And each time his voice got a little quieter. But it wasn't a straight line. There were setbacks, moments when the doubt came roaring back louder than ever. Days when I'd spend hours working on something, only to tear it apart in frustration because it wasn't perfect. Nights when I'd fall asleep with tears drying on my cheeks because I was so sure I was fooling myself that I'd never be enough. I didn't tell anyone about those nights. I didn't want anyone's pity, didn't want anyone to tell me I was overreacting. Because deep down, I knew that this was my fight. No one else could silence that voice for me. I had to do it myself. And so I kept going. I kept working. I kept showing up for myself, even when it felt like I was the only one in the world who believed I could be more than what he'd said. Because I knew that if I stopped, if I let his words be the last word, I'd never forgive myself. Some nights when the world was asleep and the city was quiet, I'd stand at my window and look out at the lights stretching into the distance. And I'd whisper to myself, "You're not done. You're just getting started." Question at the end. Have you ever felt like you're fighting a war no one else can see? I have. But I'm still here, and I'm not done. The days that followed were a strange mix of exhaustion and stubborn hope. Every morning, I woke up with that old fear pressing down on me like a weight, but each night I fell asleep with a tiny ember of defiance still glowing in my chest. I didn't know how to feed that ember, didn't know how to turn it into something bigger, but I wasn't ready to let it go out. I started small. I made a list of every dream I'd ever had, big ones and little ones, things I'd once been too afraid to admit, even to myself. I wrote them down in a battered notebook, the one I'd carried with me since college, but had never really used. It felt strange at first, like I was confessing something too raw and private. But with each word I wrote, I felt a little more alive. In the quiet of my apartment, I read those dreams out loud. My voice was shaky, but I spoke them anyway. I want to build something that lasts. I want to prove to myself that I'm more than what he said. I want to live a life that feels like mine. The words felt like seeds I was planting in the dark, unsure if they'd ever grow, but needing to believe they could. During the days I kept up my routine work errands, the same rhythms of a life that looked normal from the outside. But inside, something had shifted. I started to see small chances to push myself to test the edges of what I thought I was capable of. Little things, speaking up in meetings, when I used to stay silent, offering ideas, even when my voice trembled. They weren't big victories, but they were mine. Some days it felt like I was just going through the motions, like I was still that same scared person, pretending to be brave. But other days, on the good days, I felt a flicker of something real, a spark that said, "Keep going." At night, I'd sit at my desk with the notebook open and read those dreams again. I'd think about everything he'd ever said to me, every time he'd told me I'd never be enough, every time he'd looked at me like I was small and unworthy. And I'd let that spark grow a little brighter, because I knew the only way to fight his voice was to believe in my own. I started to take small steps toward the dreams I'd written down. I signed up for a class in something I'd always wanted to learn, even though it terrified me. I reached out to people I admired, asking questions and soaking up their stories. Each step felt like a quiet rebellion, a way of telling the world and him that I wasn't done yet. There were setbacks, of course. Days when the old doubts came back stronger than ever, whispering that I was fooling myself, that I'd never really be enough. On those days, I'd sit in the dark with tears in my eyes, wondering if he'd been right all along. But even then, I didn't stop. I couldn't, because that tiny ember in my chest was still there, and I wasn't ready to let it die. One night, after a long day of pushing myself in ways that left me raw and aching, I stood in front of the mirror and looked at my reflection. My eyes were tired, and there were shadows under them that hadn't been there a year ago. But there was something else, too, a kind of quiet strength I didn't recognize at first. It wasn't loud or flashy, but it was real. It was mine. I realized then that I didn't need to be perfect to be enough. I didn't need to meet anyone else's expectations, not his, not the world's. So, I just needed to keep going, to keep fighting for the life I wanted. And maybe that was enough. I went to bed that night with that thought wrapped around me like a blanket. I wasn't done. I wasn't perfect. But I was trying. And for now, that was enough. I started to carve out moments for myself, moments to just breathe and be. I went on long walks without my phone, letting the rhythm of my steps and the fresh air clear the static in my head. It was a small act of defiance against the voice in my mind that kept saying I was wasting my time, that I should be working instead of wandering. But those walks became a kind of prayer, a quiet promise to myself that I was more than my fears. Sometimes I'd find myself talking to strangers, casual conversations at a coffee shop, or in line at the grocery store. I'd ask them about their lives, their dreams, and listen to their stories with a kind of hunger I hadn't felt in years. It reminded me that everyone carried something, a hope, a regret, a fear. And in those small connections, I felt less alone. I also started to write more journals filled with half-formed thoughts and honest confessions. The words didn't have to be pretty or perfect. They just had to be true. Some nights, I'd write until my hand cramped, pouring out everything I'd been too afraid to say out loud. And in those pages, I started to see a different version of myself. Not the one he'd tried to define, but the one I was still becoming. The more I wrote, the more I realized that my dreams weren't just fantasies. They were possibilities. They were seeds of a life I hadn't dared to plant yet. And every word I wrote was a way of tending to them, of giving them room to grow. There were still hard days. Days when the weight of his words pressed down on me so hard I could barely stand. But on those days, I'd go back to that notebook, to the list of dreams that had once felt too big to say out loud, and I'd remind myself that they were mine, and no one else's doubt could take them away. I didn't become fearless overnight, but little by little, I became braver. I learned that courage isn't about being loud or bold, it's about showing up even when you're scared. It's about taking one more step even when your legs are shaking. One morning, I woke up and realized that I didn't hear his voice in my head as often anymore. It was still there, but it was quieter. And in its place, I could hear my own voice growing louder, more confident. A voice that said, "You're not done yet. You're becoming everything." And that was enough to keep me moving forward. Question at the end. Have you ever felt that shift the moment when your own voice starts to drown out the voices of everyone who ever doubted you? I have. And I'm finally learning to trust it. The first step forward wasn't some grand gesture or dramatic turning point. It was a quiet decision in the middle of the night, when the world was sleeping and I was tired of feeling small. I sat at my desk, the glow of the lamp, the only light in the room, and opened my notebook to a fresh page. I wrote down 3 words, "I am enough." They looked small on the page, almost fragile, but they felt powerful in my chest, like I was planting a flag in the ground of my own life. I didn't know if I fully believed them yet, but I wanted to, and for now, that was enough. The next morning, I woke up with those words still echoing in my head. I carried them with me, like a shield, as I went about my day, getting coffee, sitting in meetings, answering emails. Every time doubt tried to creep back in, I whispered them to myself, "I am enough." It wasn't magic. The doubt didn't vanish overnight. There were still moments when his voice felt louder than mine, when I wondered if I was just pretending. But I kept saying those words anyway, like a promise to myself. I started to look for small ways to act on that promise. I volunteered for a project at work that I would have shied away from before, too afraid of failing to even try. My hands were shaking when I raised them in the meeting, my voice quiet but steady. And when they said yes, something shifted inside me. A tiny crack in the wall of fear I'd built around myself. The project was hard. There were days when I felt like I was in over my head, when I wanted to quit and go back to the safety of the sidelines. But each time I pushed myself to keep going. I read everything I could find, asked for help when I needed it, and reminded myself that I didn't have to be perfect, I just had to try. As the weeks passed, I started to see the difference. Not in the project itself, but in me. I was still scared, still unsure, but I wasn't letting that stop me anymore. Each time I took a step forward, it felt like I was rewriting the story he'd tried to write for me. Outside of work, I started to explore the dreams I'd written down in my notebook. I took a painting class, even though I'd always thought of myself as someone who couldn't draw a straight line. I signed up for a half marathon even though I'd never run more than a mile in my life. It wasn't about being the best or proving anything to anyone else. It was about proving to myself that I could try. Some nights, I still lay awake with the weight of his words pressing down on me. You'll never be enough. It was like a ghost that wouldn't leave me alone. But I learned to talk back to that voice. I'd whisper into the darkness, watch me. And slowly, I started to believe it. I started to believe that I was more than his doubts, more than his judgment. That I was allowed to want things for myself, to take up space in the world without apologizing for it. I wasn't fearless. There were still days when I felt like I was pretending, like any minute now, someone would see through the act and tell me to sit back down. But I kept going anyway. I kept taking those small steps, even when my legs were shaking. And each time I did, I felt that tiny ember in my chest glow a little brighter. Each time I took a risk, each time I refused to let his voice be the loudest one in my head, I felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself. I also started reaching out to people. I trusted people who had always seen something in me, even when I couldn't see it myself. I let them see the messy parts, the fear, the doubt, the nights when I wanted to give up. And instead of pity or judgment, they offered me kindness. They reminded me that I didn't have to do it alone. Talking to them didn't erase the doubt, but it made it easier to bear. It helped me remember that I wasn't the only one who had ever felt small, who had ever heard someone else's voice saying, "You're not enough." And in that shared understanding, I found strength. One afternoon, I went for a run to clear my head. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but with every step I felt a little stronger. I thought about all the times I'd let fear keep me small, all the times I'd let someone else's words decide how far I could go. And I decided right there, on that quiet street, with the wind in my face, that I was done letting anyone else define me. When I got home, I wrote it down in my notebook. I decide who I am. And every time I opened those pages, I saw those words staring back at me, a promise I was determined to keep. By the end of that week, the project I'd volunteered for was finished. It wasn't perfect, but it was done. And as I stood in front of my team to present what I'd created, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: pride. Not because it was flawless, but because it was mine. Because I'd done it, even though I was scared. After the meeting, one of my coworkers pulled me aside. She said, "You looked so confident up there." And I almost laughed, because inside I'd felt anything but. But maybe that's what growth looks like, showing up, even when your heart is racing and your hands are shaking, taking the step anyway. That night, I sat at my desk and looked back at everything I'd written. All the dreams, all the fears, all the tiny steps forward. And I realized that I was starting to see myself differently. Not as someone who would never be enough, but as someone who was learning, someone who was growing. I knew I still had a long way to go. I knew there would be more days when the doubt would come roaring back, more nights when I'd lie awake wondering if I was really cut out for any of this. But I also knew that I'd taken that first step. And that was the hardest part. Because once you start, once you prove to yourself that you can take that step, the rest doesn't feel quite so impossible. Question at the end: have you ever realized that the hardest part isn't the whole journey? It's just taking that first step. I have. And I'm not turning back. The nights grew longer, and sleep became a luxury I couldn't seem to afford. My mind was always racing, turning over every word, every doubt, every tiny step forward I'd taken. Some nights, I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds as they ticked by in the dark. It felt like I was fighting a war inside my own head. One part of me was still so scared of failing, of not being enough, of proving him right. But another part of me was louder than it had ever been, a quiet voice that whispered, "Keep going. You're stronger than you think." I'd sit at my desk long after midnight, the glow of the lamp casting a circle of light around me. The rest of the apartment was in shadow, but that little circle felt like a safe haven. I'd write in my notebook, my pen scratching across the page as I poured out every fear and every flicker of hope. Some nights, the words came easily, like a dam breaking open, all the things I'd held back, spilling out onto the page. Other nights, I'd sit there for hours staring at the blank page, my thoughts tangled and heavy. But even then, I stayed. because I knew that showing up for myself, even when it was hard, was the only way to keep moving forward. During the day, I kept going through the motions work errands, the endless to-do list that never seemed to get any shorter. But at night, when the world was quiet, that was when the real work happened. That was when I faced the voices in my head and told them I wasn't done yet. It wasn't glamorous. There were no grand victories, no dramatic breakthroughs. Just me alone in the dark, refusing to let go of the tiny spark I'd found. It was exhausting, but it was also the most honest I'd ever been with myself. I learned to take breaks to let myself rest when I needed to. I started to understand that rest wasn't weakness, it was fuel. On the nights when I felt like I couldn't go on, I'd curl up on the couch with a blanket and a cup of tea, letting the quiet soothe the chaos in my head. And in those small moments of stillness, I found a kind of peace. But even in the quiet, the doubt was never far away. Some nights, it would creep in like a fog, wrapping around me, until I couldn't see anything else. I'd hear his voice in my mind, that same cold certainty, "You'll never be enough." And I'd wonder if I was just fooling myself, if all my efforts were nothing more than a desperate attempt to outrun the truth. On those nights, I'd go back to my notebook, reading the dreams I'd written down. I'd remind myself why I was fighting, why I couldn't let his voice be the one that decided who I was. And even when I felt like I was drowning in doubt, I'd force myself to take one more step. I started to realize that the real battle wasn't about proving him wrong, it was about proving to myself that I was worth the fight, that I was allowed to take up space, to have dreams, to want more than what he'd told me I could have. Some nights, I'd look out the window at the city lights and think about all the other people who were awake fighting their own battles in the dark. It made me feel less alone, knowing that somewhere out there, someone else was taking their own small steps forward. And in that shared struggle, I found a kind of strength. I learned to celebrate the small victories, finishing a project at work, even if it wasn't perfect, going for a run, even when my legs felt like lead, writing a page in my journal, even if the words didn't come out right. Each small win was a reminder that I was still here, still trying. And slowly, I started to believe that maybe that was enough. The nights were still long. There were still moments when the fear felt bigger than anything else, when I wanted to give up and go back to being the person he thought I was. But I didn't. Because every time I chose to keep going, I was rewriting the story he'd tried to write for me. One night, I stayed up until dawn, working on a project that scared me more than anything I'd ever done. My hands were shaking, my eyes burning, but I didn't stop. And when I finally finished, as the first light of morning slipped through the curtains, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: pride. It wasn't about the work itself, it was about the fact that I hadn't given up, that I'd stayed in the fight even when it felt like I was losing. And in that moment, I realized that maybe that was the real victory. Because the truth is, there will always be doubt. There will always be someone who says you're not enough. But if you keep showing up for yourself, if you keep taking those small, brave steps in the dark, eventually you start to see that their voices don't matter as much as you thought they did. In those dawn hours when the sky was turning from black to blue, and the city was just beginning to stir, I realized that the night had given me something I didn't know I needed: proof that I could keep going, even when I didn't think I could. That I could sit with the fear and the doubt and still find the courage to take one more step. And that's what those nights became for me: a practice in resilience, a quiet vow that no matter how long the dark stretched on, I would not let it swallow me whole. I started to see that the person I was becoming wasn't born in the bright moments of victory, but in the long, quiet hours when no one else was watching, in the moments when it was just me and my fears, and I chose to keep going anyway. Because in the end, that's what it comes down to. Not the big dramatic gestures, but the small, stubborn act of refusing to give up. Of showing up for yourself even when you're the only one who knows you're still fighting. Question at the end: have you ever spent a night fighting your own fears, only to find that you're stronger in the morning? I have. And I'm not done yet. The days started to feel a little different, though I couldn't always say how. There was still the fear, still the doubt, but there was something else now, too: a small, persistent light that kept flickering no matter how dark things felt. It was in the way I woke up in the morning, feeling a little more hopeful, even if I didn't understand why. It was in the way I caught myself smiling at small things, a song on the radio, the smell of fresh coffee, the warmth of the sun on my face. Little moments of light in the middle of everything. At work, I started to feel more confident in my voice. I didn't always have the answers, and I still stumbled sometimes, but I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I shared my ideas in meetings, even when my heart was pounding. And each time I did, I felt that small light in my chest glow a little brighter. Outside of work, I let myself dream a little bigger. I started setting goals that once would have felt too big, too impossible. I didn't know how I'd reach them, but I let myself want them anyway. And that felt like a kind of victory. There were still bad days, of course. Days when the weight of everything felt too heavy to carry, when the old doubts came back louder than ever. But even on those days, the light didn't go out. It was there, flickering in the background, a quiet reminder that I was stronger than I knew. One afternoon, I took a walk through the city, my headphones in my mind lost in the music. I wandered without a plan, letting the rhythm of the streets and the beat of the music carry me forward. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. I started to notice the way the light hit the buildings, the way the wind felt against my skin. I started to see beauty in places I'd always overlooked, the graffiti on the walls, the way the leaves danced in the breeze. It was like the world had cracked open a little, letting in just enough light for me to see that there was more than the fear and the doubt. At night, I'd sit by my window and watch the city lights twinkle in the darkness. And I'd think about how far I'd come, how many nights I'd spent feeling like I was drowning, and how I'd kept going anyway. I'd think about the way I'd learned to trust that small light, even when I couldn't see the path ahead. There were moments when I still felt lost, still felt like I was just pretending. But those moments didn't last as long as they used to, because I knew now that I didn't have to have it all figured out. I just had to keep going one step at a time. One evening, I met a friend for coffee. We sat by the window, the warm glow of the cafe, wrapping around us like a blanket. She asked me how I was doing, really doing, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't lie. I told her about the fear, about the nights I'd spent awake, about the small light I'd found that kept me going. She listened without judgment, her eyes kind and steady. And when I was done, she said, "You're not the same person you were a year ago. I can see it in your eyes." And for the first time, I believed her. I went home that night and sat at my desk, my notebook open in front of me. I wrote down everything I was feeling, the fear, the hope, the quiet strength that was starting to take root. And as I wrote, I realized that this was what it meant to grow. Not to be fearless, but to keep moving forward even when you were scared. I knew there would be more dark nights, more days when the weight of everything felt like too much. But I also knew that the light I'd found wasn't going anywhere. It was mine, and no one could take it away from me. Because in the end, that light wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving to myself that I was worth fighting for, that my dreams were worth the struggle, even on the hardest days. I also started to notice how much I had been holding myself back before. How many times I'd said no to things I wanted to do because I was afraid of failing. How many times I'd stayed silent when I had something to say because I was scared of being wrong. Now I was done staying silent. I was done letting fear decide what I was allowed to want. So I said yes, even when I was scared. I raised my hand even when my voice shook. I told the people I cared about how much they meant to me, even when the words felt too big to say out loud. And each time I did, the light grew a little brighter. Each time I took a chance, I felt a little more alive. I started to realize that the life I wanted wasn't waiting for me somewhere down the road. It was here in the small choices I made every day, in the moments when I chose to show up, to speak up, to keep going, even when it felt easier to stop. Some nights, I'd still lie awake with the weight of everything pressing down on me. I'd think about all the ways I still felt small, all the ways I still didn't know how to be enough. But even on those nights, I could feel the light in my chest, reminding me that I was still here, that I was still fighting, And maybe that was the most important thing. Not being fearless, not having all the answers, but refusing to let the darkness win. Because every time I chose to keep going, every time I chose to believe in that small light, I was choosing myself. I was choosing the life I wanted to build one step at a time. As I watched the first light of dawn slip through the window, painting the world in soft gold and pink, I felt a quiet certainty settle in my chest. I wasn't done yet, and I knew that as long as I kept going, that light would keep growing. Question at the end. Have you ever realized that the light inside you is your own, that no one else can take it away? I have. And I'm learning to trust it. I always knew there would come a day when I'd see him again. I didn't know when or where, but I knew. It was like a quiet promise the world had made to me that someday I'd stand face to face with the person who'd once made me doubt everything about myself. When it finally happened, it wasn't in some dramatic setting. It was at a networking event of all places, an afternoon of handshakes and small talk, name tags, and forced smiles. I'd almost decided not to go, but something in me said, show up. And so I did. He was standing across the room, talking to someone I didn't recognize. At first, I didn't even see him. I was too focused on the conversation I was having, too caught up in making sure my voice was steady, my smile easy. But then I turned, and there he was. My heart stuttered in my chest, but I didn't let it stop me. I didn't look away. I didn't shrink back. I just took a slow breath and walked across the room. He didn't see me at first. He was still laughing at something his friend had said, his posture relaxed, his smile practiced. But when his eyes met mine, the smile faltered. Just for a moment. And then it was back. But I'd seen it, the flicker of surprise, the uncertainty. Hey! I said, my voice calm. Steady. It's been a while. He looked at me, and for a moment, I wondered if he would pretend not to know me. But then he nodded, his smile tightening at the edges. Yeah, he said. It has. We talked for a few minutes, small talk, nothing more. He asked me how work was going, and I told him the truth, that it was going well, that I was working on things that mattered to me. He nodded, polite and distant, and I wondered if he could hear the quiet strength in my voice, the certainty that hadn't been there before. For a moment, there was a silence between us. A long, heavy pause that felt like the space between two chapters of a story. And then he said it softly, almost like he didn't mean to say it at all. I didn't think you'd make it. I felt the words hit me like a wave, but they didn't knock me down this time. I just looked at him, my head held high, and said, I know. And in that moment, I realized that I didn't need him to see me any differently. I didn't need him to understand how hard I'd fought or how far I'd come, because I knew, and that was enough. We said goodbye, a handshake and a polite smile, and I walked away feeling lighter than I had in years, because I knew that the person I'd become wasn't because of him, it was in spite of him. That night, I lay awake in bed thinking about that conversation, about how different it had felt to stand there calm and sure of myself when once I would have been shaking. And I realized that was the real victory, not that I'd proven him wrong, but that I'd proven myself right. I knew there would still be days when his voice echoed in my head, days when the old doubts came back whispering that I'd never be enough. But I also knew that I'd faced him now, and I hadn't backed down. And that meant something, because in the end, it wasn't about him at all. It was about me, about the person I was becoming, the person I was choosing to be. After I walked away, I found a quiet corner in the event hall and took a moment to breathe. My hands were shaking a little, but my heart felt calm, steadier than it had in a long time. I watched the crowd around me, people laughing, networking, lost in their own conversations, and I realized that I was no longer lost in his shadow. I thought about all the nights I'd spent worrying about what he would think if he saw me again, all the ways I'd rehearsed what I might say, how I might prove to him that I'd made it. And yet when the moment came, none of that seemed to matter, because it wasn't about proving anything to him, it was about showing up for myself. I stayed at the event for a while longer, talking to new people, sharing ideas. Each conversation felt like another small victory, another step away from the person I'd been, when I'd first believed his words. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was just being myself, and for the first time that felt like enough. Later that night, I went for a walk through the city. The streets were quiet, the air cool and crisp, and I felt the weight of the evening slowly start to lift. I thought about everything I'd faced to get to this point, the long nights, the self-doubt, the fear that had once felt so heavy I could barely breathe. And I felt a quiet pride settle in my chest. I realized then that seeing him again hadn't just been about closure. It had been about reclaiming my own story, about standing there in front of the person who had once made me feel so small, and knowing that I wasn't small anymore. When I got home, I pulled out my notebook and wrote down everything I was feeling. I wrote about the way he'd looked at me, the way his smile had faltered when he realized I was no longer the person he thought I was. I wrote about the strength I'd found in myself, the light that had kept growing even when I was sure it would go out. And as I wrote, I felt something shift inside me. A sense of finality, maybe. Or maybe just a quiet knowing that I didn't need to carry his voice with me anymore. I closed the notebook and sat in the silence of my apartment, feeling that small light in my chest, glowing, steady, and sure. I knew there would still be challenges ahead, still days when the doubt crept back in. But I also knew that I'd faced him now, and I hadn't flinched. And that was enough. Question at the end: have you ever realized that the real power was never in what they thought of you, but in what you chose to believe about yourself? I have. And I'm not done yet. After that day, something shifted inside me. It was like a weight I'd been carrying for years had finally lifted. I still had doubts, of course some days more than others, but they didn't feel as heavy as they used to. Because I'd looked him in the eye, and I hadn't flinched. And that meant something. I started to notice the ways my life was changing, almost without me realizing it. I spoke with more confidence in meetings, even when I wasn't sure if my ideas were good enough. I took more risks, small ones at first, then bigger ones, as I learned to trust myself. I started to feel like the person I'd always wanted to be. I also noticed the way other people started to look at me differently. There was a respect in their eyes that hadn't been there before, and while I knew I didn't need anyone else's validation, it still felt good to be seen. To be recognized, not for what I'd done, but for the way I showed up every day and kept going. But more than anything, I noticed the way I started to see myself. Not as someone who was broken, or not enough, but as someone who was still learning, still growing, still here. Some days were harder than others. There were still moments when the old fear would creep back in, whispering that I was only pretending that I'd never really be enough. But those moments didn't last as long as they used to. Because now, when I heard that voice, I knew how to answer it. I'd remind myself of everything I'd already survived. Of the nights I'd spent fighting my own doubts, of the mornings I'd woken up and chosen to keep going anyway. I'd remind myself that courage wasn't about never being afraid, it was about showing up even when you were. And each time I did, the fear lost a little more of its power. One afternoon, I took a long walk through the city, letting the rhythm of my steps calm the noise in my head. I thought about the person I was becoming, someone who was willing to take risks, to speak up, to believe in herself, even when it was hard. And I realized that was what I wanted more than anything, to live a life that felt like mine. I also started to reconnect with people I'd lost touch with during the years I'd spent trying to be what someone else wanted me to be. Old friends who remembered who I was, before the doubt crept in, who saw the light in me even when I couldn't. We talked for hours, catching up on lost time, and I felt something in me heal. At work, I took on projects that scared me, not because I was trying to prove anything to anyone else, but because I wanted to prove it to myself. I wanted to see what I was capable of when I stopped holding myself back. Some days it was hard. There were moments when I wanted to run back to the safety of the familiar, to the quiet comfort of not trying. But each time I pushed through. Each time I reminded myself that the only way to build the life I wanted was to keep going even when it felt impossible. I also started to see the way the world opened up when I allowed myself to be seen. I reached out to colleagues I'd always admired, but never had the courage to approach. I shared my ideas with them, let them see the parts of me I'd once kept hidden away. And in those conversations, I found something I hadn't realized I'd been missing: connection. One colleague, a woman whose quiet determination I'd always respected, told me, "You've got more grit than most people I know." Her words sank into me like a seed planted deep in the earth. They weren't meant to define me, but they reminded me of the quiet strength I'd always carried, even when I didn't know it was there. I also started to let myself be proud of the small wins: finishing a tough project on time, getting up early to go for a run, even on days when it felt impossible, saying no when I needed to protect my energy, even if it disappointed someone else. These weren't the kind of things that made headlines, but they mattered to me. And in each small victory, I felt that light in my chest grow a little stronger. Some nights, I'd still lie awake and wonder if it would ever be enough, if I would ever feel like I'd truly become the person I wanted to be. But even in those moments, there was a new kind of softness in the way I spoke to myself. Less judgment, more patience. Less anger, more understanding. Because I was starting to see that healing wasn't a single moment of triumph, it was a slow, steady journey. It was in the way I showed up for myself day after day, even when no one else was watching. I also started to dream bigger dreams. I applied for a leadership role I'd once thought was out of reach, not because I was sure I'd get it, but because I wanted to prove to myself that I could try. I started to think about the kind of life I wanted to build beyond work, what it would look like to create a space for myself that felt like home, to surround myself with people who made me feel seen. And maybe, most importantly, I let go of the idea that my worth was something I had to earn. I let myself believe that I was enough just as I was, that I didn't need to be perfect to be worthy of respect, of love, of a life that felt real. By the end of that month, I found myself standing taller. Not because the fear had disappeared, but because I'd learned how to live with it, how to let it be there without letting it make my choices for me. And in that quiet strength, I found a kind of freedom I'd never known before. Question at the end: have you ever realized that your strength isn't measured by how loud you roar, but by how quietly you keep going, even when it's hard? I have. And I'm not done yet. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being afraid of the dark. I stopped seeing it as something to be avoided and started to see it as a place where I could learn, where I could grow. The darkness wasn't empty. It was full of the quiet truths I'd been too busy to notice. I started to see that the moments when I felt most lost were the moments when I was closest to something real. Because it was in those moments, the nights when I felt like I was drowning, the days when the fear was loudest, that I learned what I was made of. I realized that the darkness wasn't trying to break me. It was trying to show me who I could be if I stopped running from it. So I stopped running. I stood still and let it wash over me, let it teach me what it had to say. And in that stillness, I found a kind of peace I'd never known before. I started to see the way the world softened when I stopped fighting it. The way the light always found its way back in, even on the longest nights. And I started to trust that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to have all the answers to keep going. At work, I kept pushing myself, kept taking on projects that scared me. I stopped worrying about what people thought and started focusing on what felt true to me. And I started to see the difference, not in the way other people measured success, but in the way I measured it. I saw it in the way I walked into meetings with my head held high, in the way I spoke up even when my voice shook. I saw it in the way I listened to other people, really listened, instead of just waiting for my turn to talk. And in the way I offered help, not because I wanted to be seen, but because I knew what it felt like to feel small and alone. Outside of work, I let myself rest. I let myself find joy in the small things, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees on my morning walk, the taste of my favorite coffee on a quiet afternoon. I let myself be present even when the future felt uncertain. Some days, the darkness still felt heavy. There were nights when I lay awake, my mind spinning, with all the ways I still felt like I was falling short. But I didn't run from those nights anymore. I let them be what they were, a reminder that I was still alive, still here, still trying. And slowly, I started to see that maybe that was enough. One evening, I stood on my balcony and watched the sunset behind the city skyline. The sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, and for a moment, everything felt still. I thought about the person I'd been a year ago, so scared, so certain I would never be enough. And I thought about the person I was becoming. Not fearless, not perfect, but brave enough to keep going even when it was hard. I realized then that the darkness would always be there in one form or another. There would always be moments when the doubt crept back in, when the fear felt too big to face. But I also knew that I had learned how to stand in that darkness and find the light. And that was something no one could take away from me. I went inside and pulled out my notebook, the pages worn soft from all the nights I'd spent writing my way through the fear. I wrote about the sunset, about the way the city lights flickered on one by one, about the quiet strength I felt in my chest. I wrote about the way I'd learned to trust myself even when it felt like no one else did. And I wrote about the way I'd learned to love the darkness, not because it was easy, but because it had taught me who I was. I also started to see how the darkness connected me to other people in ways I hadn't noticed before. In conversations with friends, I found myself listening more deeply, understanding their struggles in a way I hadn't before. I realized that we were all fighting our own battles, all carrying our own shadows. And in those moments of honesty, I felt less alone. One friend shared a story of how she'd spent years doubting herself, always feeling like she was never enough. She told me how she'd finally learned to stop trying to please everyone and start listening to her own voice. As she spoke, I saw the same determination in her eyes that I'd found in my own. And I realized that we were both learning the same lesson, that the darkness didn't mean we were weak, it meant we were human. I also started to notice the ways I was growing stronger in small everyday moments, like when I chose to rest instead of pushing myself past the point of exhaustion, or when I allowed myself to say no to something that didn't feel right, even if it meant disappointing someone else. Those small choices added up day by day until I could feel the shift in my bones. I began to see that healing wasn't a destination, it was a practice. It was in the way I showed up for myself, in the quiet hours, in the way I kept trying, even when it felt like I was moving backward. And in that practice, I found a kind of quiet power. One night, as I walked home from work, I stopped at a small park and sat on a bench, watching the city lights sparkle against the night sky. I thought about all the times I'd been afraid to take up space to let myself want something more. And I realized that those fears hadn't disappeared. They'd just lost their power to control me. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill my lungs. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because I was learning to trust the journey. When I got home, I wrote down those feelings in my notebook. I wrote about the way the darkness had once felt like an enemy and how it had become a teacher instead. I wrote about the way I was learning to see the beauty in the struggle, the way the light and the dark were always intertwined. And as I wrote, I felt a quiet promise forming in my heart. A promise to keep going, to keep showing up, even when it was hard. Because I knew now that the darkness wasn't the end of the story, it was just another chapter. Question at the end. Have you ever realized that the darkness you feared was the same place where your strength was born? I have. And I'm learning to trust that strength. The morning light slipped through the curtains, painting the walls of my room in a soft, hopeful glow. I stretched in bed, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the heaviness of the past pressing down on me. It felt like a new beginning, like the start of a chapter I'd been waiting to write, even if I didn't know exactly how it would go. I got out of bed and stood at the window, watching the city come to life. The streets were quiet, the world still waking up, and in that quiet, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known before. It wasn't that the fear was gone, it was still there, a familiar ache in my chest, but it didn't feel like it was in control anymore. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the steam rising in soft tendrils. I thought about everything I'd been through to get to this moment: the doubt, the fear, the nights I'd spent wondering if I'd ever feel like enough. And I realized that every one of those moments had brought me here. I wasn't the same person I'd been when I started this journey. I was stronger now, more sure of myself, more willing to take up space in the world. And I knew that no matter what happened next, I had already proven to myself that I could keep going. I spent the morning working on a project I'd been putting off for weeks, the kind of thing that had always felt too big, too impossible. But as I worked, I felt the old fear slipping away, replaced by a quiet determination. I didn't need to be perfect, I just needed to keep trying. In the afternoon, I met up with a friend for lunch. We sat in the corner of a cozy cafe, the smell of fresh bread and roasted coffee wrapping around us like a blanket. She asked me how I was really doing, and for the first time, I didn't hesitate. I'm okay, I said. I'm still figuring it out, but I'm not giving up. She smiled and reached across the table, squeezing my hand. I'm proud of you, she said. And in that moment, I believed her. We talked about our dreams, about the things we still wanted to do, the places we still wanted to go, and I realized that I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was dreaming again. I was allowing myself to hope to want more, even when it scared me. When I got home, I opened my notebook and wrote down those dreams. Some of them were small, like learning to cook a new recipe, or taking a day to do nothing but read. Others were bigger, like traveling to a place I'd always wanted to see, or starting a project that felt too big to name. And as I wrote, I felt that quiet light in my chest grow a little brighter. The evening came soft and gentle, the sky painted in shades of lavender and gold. I went for a walk through the neighborhood, breathing in the cool air, feeling the rhythm of my steps settle the thoughts in my head. I thought about how far I'd come, about the way I'd learned to stand in the dark and find the light. I also thought about all the ways I still wanted to grow. I knew the journey wasn't over, that there would still be days when the doubt crept back in, when the fear felt too heavy to carry. But I also knew that I wasn't the same person I'd been when I'd first heard those words, "You'll never be enough," because now I knew that I was. As the night settled in, I sat by the window and watched the city lights flicker to life. I thought about the people I'd met along the way, the stories I'd heard, the strength I'd found in myself and in others, and I felt a quiet gratitude settle in my chest. I realized that this was what it meant to keep going. Not to be fearless, but to keep showing up day after day, even when it was hard. To keep choosing hope, even when it felt impossible. To keep believing in the light, even when the world felt dark. I also let myself think about the future in ways I hadn't let myself before. For years, I'd been so focused on just surviving, on getting through one day at a time, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to dream. But now, with the sun setting and the city alive with possibility, I let myself imagine what could be. I thought about the kind of work I wanted to do, the kind that would challenge me, that would make me feel alive. I thought about the relationships I wanted to build, the friendships that felt like home. I thought about the places I wanted to see, the small towns and big cities that had always felt like distant dreams. And I realized that even if I didn't have all the answers, even if the path ahead was still uncertain, I was no longer afraid to take the first step. That night, I called my mom. We hadn't talked much lately, life had gotten busy, and there had been so much I'd been afraid to share. But as we talked, I found myself telling her about the things I'd been working on, the ways I'd been growing. And when I hung up the phone, I felt lighter somehow, like a weight I hadn't even known I was carrying had finally been set down. I spent the rest of the night curled up on the couch, a cup of tea in my hands, the soft hum of the city outside my window. I thought about the woman I was becoming, someone who was learning to trust herself, who was learning to believe that she was enough. And I felt a quiet pride settle in my chest, because I knew that no matter what happened next, I was ready to face it. Not because I thought it would be easy, but because I knew I had already faced so much and come out stronger on the other side. When I finally went to bed that night, I felt the calm certainty that tomorrow was waiting for me. And for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see what it would bring. Question at the end. Have you ever felt the weight of a new beginning, the quiet promise that today is the start of something better I have? And I'm ready to begin. The days that followed felt different. There was a lightness to them, a quiet sense of calm that had been missing for so long. It wasn't that everything was suddenly perfect, far from it, but there was a steadiness in me that hadn't been there before, a quiet confidence that said, I can do this. I started to notice the small ways my life was changing. The way I woke up in the morning, feeling a little more hopeful, a little more ready to face the day. The way I moved through my routines, not with the heavy steps of someone just trying to survive, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knew she was growing. At work, I found myself taking more chances. I spoke up in meetings without second-guessing every word. I offered ideas even when they felt half-formed, trusting that they would grow into something more. And slowly, the people around me started to see me differently. They listened when I spoke. They trusted me with projects that once would have felt out of reach. And while their faith in me was encouraging, it was my own faith in myself that mattered most. Outside of work, I kept exploring the dreams I'd once been too afraid to say out loud. I signed up for a photography class, something I'd always wanted to try. I spent Saturday mornings wandering through the city, my camera in hand, seeing the world in new ways. It wasn't about being the best photographer or even taking the perfect shot, it was about learning to see, to pay attention, to find the beauty in the everyday. Some days were still hard. There were mornings when the old fear would creep in, whispering that I was still that same scared girl who had once believed she wasn't enough. But now I knew how to talk back to that voice. I'd stand at the mirror, look myself in the eye, and say, "You're stronger than you think, and you're not giving up." One evening, I sat on my balcony as the sun set behind the buildings. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, and the air was warm with the promise of summer. I thought about all the nights I'd spent doubting myself, all the mornings I'd woken up determined to try again. And I realized that this was what it meant to be resilient, not to never feel afraid, but to keep moving forward anyway. I also realized that I wasn't alone in this journey. I started to notice the quiet strength in the people around me, the friend who was starting over after a heartbreak, the coworker who was learning to speak up for herself, the stranger on the street who smiled at me when I needed it most. We were all carrying our own shadows, our own fears, but we were also carrying a light that couldn't be dimmed. One night, I called a friend I hadn't spoken to in months. We talked for hours, sharing the stories we'd been too afraid to tell. And as we talked, I felt the weight of those stories lift off my shoulders, replaced by something lighter, something truer. It reminded me that healing doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in the spaces we create for each other, the conversations where we say me too. I'm still here too. In the quiet moments of those days, I also started to dream about the future in new ways. Not as a place where everything would finally be perfect, but as a place where I could keep growing. I thought about the kind of life I wanted to build, one rooted in kindness, in honesty, in the courage to keep trying, even when it was hard. I thought about the woman I wanted to be, the kind of woman who didn't measure her worth by someone else's standards, who knew that she was enough just as she was. The kind of woman who could stand in the dark and find the light again and again. And I realized that maybe I was already becoming her. I also started to pay attention to the ways I had grown in the quiet, invisible places, in the way I could pause before reacting, take a breath, and choose my response instead of letting old fears speak for me. In the way I could sit with my own discomfort, knowing it was part of the process, not something to be ashamed of. I noticed how I had become more patient with myself, more willing to give myself the grace I'd always given to others. I no longer saw my mistakes as proof of my unworthiness. Instead, I saw them as part of the path, stepping stones that showed me where I still needed to grow. Some nights, I would light a candle and sit quietly in my room, letting the flicker of the flame soothe the restless parts of me. In those moments, I would think about the dreams I still held in my heart. I would think about the small, brave steps I was taking every day to bring them closer. And I would remind myself that every step counted, even the smallest one. I also started to notice how the relationships in my life were changing, how the people who truly cared for me showed up even in the smallest ways: a text to check in, a smile across a crowded room, a quiet moment of understanding when I didn't have the words to explain. And in those moments, I felt the walls I had built around myself begin to soften. I let myself be seen in new ways. Not the perfect, polished version of myself I had always tried to be, but the messy, real version, the one who still stumbled, who still had days when she felt unsure. And instead of rejection, I found connection. Because the truth is, we're all still figuring it out. And in that shared struggle, there is so much beauty. By the end of that week, I felt a sense of quiet pride that I hadn't felt in years. Not because I had everything figured out, far from it, but because I was no longer waiting for permission to live the life I wanted. I was no longer waiting for someone else to tell me I was enough. I knew it for myself. And in that knowing, I found a strength I hadn't known I was searching for. Question at the end. Have you ever realized that your quiet strength was always there, waiting for you to see it? I have. And I'm not done yet. The morning after, I woke up to the soft light of dawn spilling across my pillow. It felt like a promise, a quiet invitation to keep moving forward. I stretched and took a deep breath, feeling the steadiness in my chest, the quiet strength I had built word by word, day by day. I got up and made my way to the kitchen, the comforting warmth of my morning coffee filling the air. I thought about how far I'd come and how many more steps I still wanted to take. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to rush. I knew now that every step, no matter how small, was part of the story. As the city outside woke up, I sat by the window and watched the world come to life. The soft hum of traffic, the laughter of children playing on the sidewalk, the quiet conversations of neighbors greeting the day, it all felt like a gentle rhythm I could trust. A reminder that life was always moving, always unfolding, whether I was ready for it or not. I spent the morning working on a new project, something that felt both exciting and terrifying. I didn't know where it would lead, but I no longer let that stop me. I had learned that sometimes the best things come from taking the first step, even if you can't see the whole path. In the afternoon, I went for a walk through the park, letting the sunlight warm my face and the cool breeze play with my hair. I watched the way the leaves danced in the wind, the way the light shifted through the branches, and I thought about how much beauty there is in the world if you just know how to look for it. I also thought about the people I had met along the way, the friends who had walked beside me, the strangers who had offered kindness when I needed it most. Their presence in my life was a testament to the power of showing up, of letting yourself be seen even when it's hard. Somewhere along that path, I realized that this journey wasn't just about me. It was about the connections I was building, the stories I was sharing, the quiet ways we all lift each other up. It was about the way we choose hope, even when it's easier to give up. I spent the evening at home, a book in my lap, and a candle flickering on the table. I let myself rest, knowing that rest was part of the journey too. I let the quiet settle around me, feeling the gentle rhythm of my breath and the soft beat of my heart. And as I sat there, I thought about everything I still wanted to do, the places I wanted to see, the words I still wanted to write, the ways I still wanted to grow. I knew there would be more hard days, more moments when the doubt would creep back in. But I also knew that I was ready to face them, because I had learned something important, that strength isn't about never feeling afraid, it's about showing up anyway. It's about choosing to keep going, even when the road is long and the way is unclear. I closed my book and stood by the window, looking out at the city lights shimmering in the dark. I thought about the woman I had become, someone who was still learning, still growing, still choosing hope. And in that reflection, I saw not just the end of a chapter, but the beginning of something new. I knew now that the journey would never really end, that there would always be more to learn, more to see, more to become. And that was okay, because I wasn't doing it alone. I also knew that there were others out there standing at the edge of their own new beginnings, wondering if they were ready to take the first step. And to them, I wanted to say, you are. You're ready. And the world is waiting. As the night settled in around me, I felt the quiet promise of tomorrow in my bones. I thought about all the small steps I'd taken to get here, the moments when I'd chosen hope over fear, when I'd trusted myself even when it felt like I was standing on the edge of the unknown. I also thought about the dreams I hadn't yet spoken out loud, the ones that still felt too big, too wild to say in the light of day. But in that quiet, I let myself believe in them anyway. Because I had learned that the first step to any dream is allowing yourself to want it. I imagined the kind of life I wanted to build in the days ahead, one where I could keep exploring, keep learning, keep growing. A life where I didn't have to have it all figured out, because the joy was in the journey itself. I also thought about the people who had stood by me in the hardest moments, the friends who had seen the truth of who I was and loved me anyway. Their faith in me had been a light in the darkest nights, and I knew I carried their kindness in every step I took. As I turned out the light and slipped beneath the blankets, I felt a quiet gratitude fill my chest. I knew there would be more challenges ahead, more days when I would question everything, but I also knew that I was ready, because I had learned that my strength wasn't something I had to earn, it was already there waiting for me to trust it. I whispered to myself in the dark, "You're still here, and you're not done yet. If you're reading this, know that your story matters. Your quiet strength, your brave steps, your gentle hope, they are worth sharing. If you're ready, leave a comment below and tell me where you are on your journey. And if you're not ready to share yet, that's okay too. Just know that I'm rooting for you, and I believe in you." Question at the end. Have you ever felt that quiet certainty that even when the road is long, you're exactly where you're meant to be? I have. And I'm ready to keep going.